The Cold War, the era of rockets, spies, and sweet little lies, when one mishap would mean we'd all end up in a nuclear apocalypse. But one thing about the Cold War is that it has so many chapters to its history that we tend to focus on the big events, the Berlin Wall, the moon landing, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that sort of thing. But what about the smaller things, the oddities that perhaps get lost in the prospect of nuclear Armageddon and communist takeovers? The stuff you won't learn in schools. Well, let's find out together, shall we? A broken arrow is a term relating to nuclear weapons-based accidents. Now, if there's anything on this planet you're supposed to treat carefully, it would be nuclear bombs. But accidents do happen, at least 32 of them to be precise. You see, the US had a policy in the 1960s that meant they constantly had nuclear weapons on planes in the air just in case of Soviet nuclear attack. This was known as Operation Chrome Dome. But there's a sensible question that you might have with flying planes with nukes on them all the time. And that's, well, what if they crash? Well, on several occasions, we have absolutely found out. The most famous example was in 1961 in Goldsboro, North Carolina, when a B-52 bomber carrying two 20-megaton hydrogen bombs exploded, jettisoning its atomic cargo towards the Earth. For one of those bombs, its parachute deployed as it should have. It was found hanging from a tree without a scratch, but the other one's parachute didn't deploy, and it smashed into the ground at high speed, burying itself in the Earth. It was later revealed that 5 of the 6 safety features on the device had failed, and that a single switch was the only thing that stopped it from detonating. These weren't the only incidents of this kind either. Documents declassified since the Cold War ended suggest that in the United States alone, there were hundreds of smaller broken arrow incidents than the established 32. We also don't know how many of these were on the Soviet side, outside of a few high-profile cases related to explosions on armed nuclear submarines. What's more, there are a number of nuclear weapons that have been completely lost, owed to broken arrow incidents that have never been recovered. They're just out there somewhere, either rendered inactive by their surroundings or perhaps just lying in wait as each safety mechanism is slowly eroded by the landscape. Which is comforting, isn't it? The US tried to kill Castro a lot during the Cold War. The Cuban president saw hundreds of attempts on his life during his reign at the hands of the CIA, and they got pretty bizarre. There were explosive seashells and a poisoned wetsuit that aimed to exploit the despot's love of diving, or the infamous explosive cigar. We could do an hours-long video on all of the attempts to kill Castro alone, but the CIA's most bizarre campaign to end Castro's reign had nothing to do with ending the leader's life at all. The year 1960. The target? Castro's beard. The CIA aimed not to assassinate Castro himself, but his character. The dictator's facial hair was iconic. If anything were to happen to it, it could discredit his image publicly. If nothing else, it would upset him enough to potentially make a mistake where a CIA spook could then finish the job. But how would the CIA assassinate Castro's beard? It's not like a spy could sneak into his room late at night with a pair of clippers without being noticed. The answer? It was chemicals. Castro was set to speak at the UN in New York City. The plan was for an operative to sprinkle thallium salts onto Castro's shoes as they were being shined. Thallium is toxic and can damage hair follicles, causing Castro's hair to fall out. Unfortunately for Fidel's facial hair hitman, Castro, ever unpredictable, cancelled the trip at the last minute. And so the CIA never got the opportunity. Castro would continue to evade US efforts to end his life for years after the fact, eventually dying of natural causes in 2016. During the Cold War, espionage was crucial in the battle over information. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Soviet and American agents traveled the world, spying on and killing each other for the sake of their governments. One key element of espionage back then was weaponry. It was important for weapons to be well hidden, so that they could be used at a moment's notice and easily blend into the surrounding landscape. And both sides went to some pretty extraordinary lengths to hide weapons in plain sight. Female KGB operatives were able to carry around a pistol hidden inside of a tube of lipstick, known as the kiss of death. Border guards were unlikely to check such a small item for weaponry, so it could easily be hidden inside a purse, and it was deadly. It was operated by pressing the barrel into the victim, at which point a single-shot 4.5mm bullet would be fired into the target. In the right circumstances, it could be utilized within seconds, with the perpetrator escaping before anyone knew what had happened. But where women were able to use lipstick, that wouldn't exactly work for male spies seeking to avoid suspicion. So, another option for a weapon easily hidden in plain sight came at the hands of everyday businessmen: the briefcase. The firearms manufacturer Heckler & Koch developed what was known as the operational briefcase. It housed an entire MP5K submachine gun hidden within it, and with a trigger mechanism in the handle, it could be carried and fired without suspicion. Having the entire gun inside the case allowed for it to mimic the weight of a standard briefcase and be fired multiple times. Nobody would know where the shot had come from, especially in European cities in the latter half of the 20th century, where businessmen with briefcases were as common as rain in London. Both weapons showcase incredible engineering ingenuity. The year was 1983. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was stationed at the command center of the Soviets' Okko nuclear early warning system. It was mere weeks after the USSR had shot down a Korean Airlines passenger jet, killing all 269 people on board after it strayed into Soviet airspace. That is to say, things were a little tense on the international stage, and when nuclear weapons are at stake, that is never a good thing. Petrov's day was going along like any other until all of a sudden the system blared to life. The US had launched 5 nuclear warheads at the USSR. The soldier was required to radio this news up to his superiors, which would trigger a retaliatory strike, causing global thermonuclear war. This was the moment that the Cold War had been building to after all those decades of tension. But Petrov hesitated. If the US was nuking the Soviet Union, they'd send a whole lot more than just 5 missiles. And Petrov's hunch was right. The Soviet satellites tasked with monitoring the US had mistaken the reflection of the sun off the clouds for nukes. Petrov, of course, didn't know this and still chose to report the incident as a false alarm based on his instincts. He was not praised for his heroics. In fact, he was reprimanded by his superiors for faulty documentation in the wake of the incident. Petrov's story went unknown for years, and he was not recognized for his world-saving efforts until 2006, when he received an award from the Association of World Citizens. He died in Russia in 2017. The Cold War popularized the concept of aliens in pop culture as outer space was brought to the silver screen. Ever since the Roswell incident, people have been fascinated by what could be among the stars and dared to dream of worlds and creatures that live amongst them. One such person was 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who was no stranger to Hollywood's charms and was a big fan of science fiction. I mean, he did call his nuclear deterrent program Star Wars. During a Geneva summit in 1985, Reagan was meeting with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. During a walk in the middle of a break in negotiations, Reagan asked the Soviet leader if, in the eventuality of an alien invasion, the US and the USSR could put aside their differences to help defend Earth. For years, it was unknown what the two spoke about. But during an interview in 2009, Gorbachev revealed the details of the conversation. Quoting the man himself here, "From the Fireside House, President Reagan suddenly said to me, 'What would you do if the United States were suddenly attacked by someone from outer space? Would you help us?' I said, 'No doubt about it.' He said, 'We too.'" "So that's interesting," Gorbachev said to much laughter. Now, aliens never attempted to invade Earth during the Cold War, at least as far as we know, so this alliance of convenience was never tested. But we do know that in the era of the space race, the US Army was tasked with working out what it would take to wage war in space. Perhaps this was a clever ploy from the president to get an idea of the Soviets' capabilities in fighting conflicts in space. But it is nice to think that both superpowers could band together in the face of an interstellar enemy.